after the war, the U.S. Congress passed a law, and the law provided that the U.S. government will comply with its commitment to compensate the Philippines for its war losses on a number of conditions. One of these conditions was that the Philippines must amend its constitution and must amend it by providing for equal rights to Americans and American corporations with respect to the exploitation of natural resources. The Constitution had reserved the exploitation of natural resources to Filipinos. And so this provision had to be amended. To amend that required a certain number of votes from Congress. 2/3 of Congress had to consent to the amendment. Now, an election was held, but the elections clearly produced congressmen who were very much opposed to this. And it was obvious that the required 2/3 majority vote was not forthcoming. And so the administration had to maneuver for the ouster of a number of congressmen and senators in order to get the 2/3 vote. And that meant ousting congressmen and senators who had been legitimately elected. Well, I was 17 years old at the time, but I remember very well that the impact of these conditions imposed by the United States government on Philippine public opinion was to produce nothing less than outrage. It was a national outrage. There was anger because a very, very sacred provision, a provision considered sacred by the Filipinos, was being violated. This had to do with the patrimony of the people. This was a provision which exclusively reserved the exploitation of the natural resources of the country to the Filipino people. Because at the time that this constitution was being drafted, there was fear precisely that because of the comparatively weak position of your Filipino businessmen and industrialists, there was danger that on independence, the Philippines would be taken over by foreign investors. This was an obsessive fear. And so this provision was nothing less than a sacred provision to the people. Well, just to give you an example of how pervasive this outrage was and how deep it was. I was then a fourth-year high school student. And when the debates came, even high school students felt deeply affected and involved. And they felt that they had to discuss this question also. And so I remember that in our physics class, we asked our professor to set aside 2 days of the week as National Debating Day, just to give the class an opportunity 2 days a week to debate the questions that were then being debated outside the classroom and by the entire nation. And our professor consented. It was that important to him. So he consented to set aside 2 days of the week, the physics class, to allow the students to debate the national questions that had been provoked by the action of the United States government. For 3 years, the Filipino people literally gave their lives and all to the cause of the American war in the Pacific, it need not have been our war. Because if we had been independent like Thailand, we probably would have been spared the occupation of the Japanese forces. But we were occupied precisely because we were a colony of the United States, we sided with the United States, there were naval and military installations of the United States in this country. So we had to be occupied. So the least we expected the United States to do was to comply with its commitment during the war and to provide those who suffered and who could prove that they suffered property losses, the necessary compensation which had been promised. Well, the compliance came, but it was attached these onerous conditions that required us to amend our Constitution just to accommodate the particular conditions laid down by the United States government. So there was complete outrage, and when the congressmen were unseated by the administration then in order to accomplish this purpose, well, one outrage simply piled after another. Because among those who were ousted were at least 2 congressmen who belonged to the Communist Party. In other words, they ran for election because they felt that there was still hope in the parliamentary struggle. And they were willing to fight it out in the parliament. They were willing to pursue their cause in the parliament peacefully. And then all of a sudden, they get struck by something like this. They were ousted and literally driven to the hills. And that's where they went. They went to the hills. And that's how the communist rebellion began.